I wasn't looking for a massive historical cover-up. I was merely looking into 19th century genealogical records, trying to trace the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of certain family lines between 1850 and 1890. I expected to find records of cholera outbreaks, of frontier accidents, of the mundane, everyday tragedies that defined the era. Instead, I stumbled into the dark, quiet ledgers of the Grand Asylums. I wasn't looking for Tartaria when I began this research. I was just trying to understand why so many perfectly healthy adults were suddenly institutionalized, locked away behind walls of impossibly precise masonry, their names erased from the public record. But as I looked closer at the structures themselves, the sheer, staggering scale of these Victorian psychiatric hospitals, the official narrative began to fracture. Look at this photograph. Take a slow, careful look at the Kirkbride buildings, the Danvers State Hospital, or the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Pan your eyes across the staggering facades. Notice the intricate stonework, the towering spires, the massive copper domes oxidizing into a melancholic green against the gray sky. We are told to look at these structures and see utilitarian hospitals for the insane. But zoom in on the sheer volume of the material. Look at the arched windows, perfectly symmetrical, stretching for literally miles of linear floor space. Notice the lower levels. Look closely at how the ground seems to swallow the bottom floor. The windows sitting directly at street level, as if the building was not constructed on the earth but dug out of it after a catastrophic inundation of mud. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. These are not the architectural choices of a medical board trying to house the sick. These are palaces. Look at the spatial geometry, the intricate cupolas that serve no medical purpose but perfectly align with the principles of drawing wireless atmospheric energy from the ether. Look at the vast, echoing halls that seem designed for a different stature of human being entirely. Why build a doorway 12 feet high for a malnourished patient in the 1870s? The proportions do not match the occupants. We are staring at the physical evidence of a grand inheritance, yet we are trained to see only a primitive medical facility. The official explanation is simple, neat, and contained. They tell us that in the mid-19th century, a sudden wave of civic philanthropy swept across the Western world. We are told that medical professionals lobbied for the moral treatment of the mentally ill, and suddenly, state governments, fresh out of the devastation of civil wars and economic panics, magically found the limitless funds to build palatial estates for society's outcasts. We are expected to believe that a horse and buggy society, consisting of towns with unpaved dirt roads and populations of merely a few thousand people, somehow marshaled the labor force to quarry, transport, and assemble millions of tons of limestone and granite using only hand chisels. It is a comforting story. It wraps up the anomalies in a neat little bow of Victorian progress. But when you apply the cold, hard lens of logistics, the official explanation collapses. It collapses entirely. Let us look at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia. The official record claims it was constructed starting in 1858. It is the second largest hand-cut stone masonry building in the world, trailing only the Kremlin. Think about the mathematical contradiction here. How does a regional government, using wooden wagons, mud roads, and hand tools, construct a massive, sprawling labyrinth of mathematically perfect stone, spanning hundreds of thousands of square feet? Where did the thousands of master masons come from? Where are the supply chains? The narrative tells us they just built it. But the sheer physics of the construction time frame presents a coordination problem that makes no logical sense. To lay that much stone, cut with such exact, unsettling precision, requires infrastructure that simply did not exist in the region at the time. You cannot forge thousands of identical ornate iron gates and window grills on a local blacksmith's anvil. What if they weren't building them at all? What if these sprawling, magnificent structures were already there. The inheritance of a highly advanced, globally connected civilization that had recently been wiped out? What if the generation of the mid-19th century were merely the scavengers, the hermit crabs moving into the empty shells left behind by a society far superior to their own? And if we didn't build these palaces, what were we using them for? As I dug deeper into the census records, the terrifying reality began to crystallize. They weren't just locking up the mentally ill. They were locking up the people who remembered, the people who knew how the old world functioned, who refused to accept the new, downgraded reality, who perhaps spoke of a time when the world was beautiful and energy was free. The asylums were not hospitals. They were holding pens for the last witnesses of the old world. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? Let us look at the numbers because the math simply does not add up. The official historical record asks us to believe that between 1850 and 1890, the United States alone constructed over 200 colossal psychiatric institutions. Look at the archival photographs of the towns surrounding these massive complexes. We see unpaved mud streets. We see wooden shacks. We see a scattered population of farmers and laborers struggling to survive the harsh winters. Yet looming on the hills above these primitive settlements are sprawling, palatial fortresses of brick, limestone, and granite. Where did the labor force come from? To build just one of these facilities, like the sprawling Danvers State Hospital, would require an army of highly skilled architects, master masons, structural engineers, and tens of thousands of laborers. They tell us these were built in mere years, a structure spanning hundreds of thousands of square feet, featuring intricate underground tunnel systems and towering Gothic spires, supposedly erected in 36 months by men using handsaws, wooden scaffolding, and wooden pulleys. It is a mathematical contradiction. Look at the photographs of the supposed construction sites. Notice the strange absence of massive equipment. Notice the men in suits standing idly next to finished masonry, posing for the camera rather than performing the back-breaking labor of cutting millions of pounds of stone. Are we looking at a construction site, or are we looking at an excavation? Are we witnessing the building of a hospital, or the unearthing and claiming of an ancient palace? Consider the logistics of transportation. The stone required for these behemoth structures had to be quarried, cut with surgical precision, and then moved. We are told this was accomplished using horses and wooden wagons over terrain that did not even have established railroad lines in many cases. Imagine the sheer tonnage. Millions of bricks, thousands of tons of structural iron and solid granite blocks. The logistical supply chain required to move this material continuously for years, without interruption, would rival modern military operations. It strains the limits of physical reality to suggest that an agrarian society, operating without combustion engines or mechanized cranes, achieved this across hundreds of locations simultaneously. And then there is the question of funding. Who paid for all of this? We are told state legislatures allocated the funds. But look at the economic realities of the 19th century. States were frequently bankrupt, recovering from civil war, dealing with hyperinflation and panics. Yet they allegedly poured what would today be billions of dollars into luxury housing for the marginalized and the mentally unwell. The official narrative requires us to believe in a sudden, inexplicable era of boundless government charity that has never been replicated since. It is a comforting fiction, but the ledgers do not balance. When you examine the material science of these asylums, the narrative fractures even further. Zoom in on the joinery of the limestone blocks. Look at the mortar lines. They are impossibly tight, razor-thin, and perfectly aligned, demonstrating an unsettling precision that baffles modern stonemasons. We cannot replicate this today with diamond-tipped saws and laser-guided heavy machinery, yet we are told it was done with hand chisels and mallets. Then, look at the roofs. Look at the massive, ornate copper domes and the towering spires. Why copper? In the official story, it is merely decorative. But in the context of atmospheric energy, copper is a highly conductive material. These domes, crowned with intricate metal finials, mirror the exact schematics of atmospheric ether extraction devices. And what of the interiors? If you have ever walked the abandoned halls of a Kirkbride building, you will notice the acoustics. The vaulted ceilings and the precise geometry of the corridors carry sound with a resonant frequency that feels mathematically calculated. These buildings were not designed to be chaotic madhouses, filled with the screams of the tortured. The architecture implies a function of healing through harmonic resonance and frequency, a technology completely absent from the brutal psychiatric practices of the 1800s. We placed straitjackets and electroshock machines inside buildings designed for acoustic healing. If X is true, if 19th century society possessed neither the technology, the labor pool, the funding, nor the logistical capability to erect these colossal, mathematically perfect fortresses, then Y must be false. The official explanation cannot be true. The math doesn't add up. And if they did not build them, there is only one logical, albeit terrifying, conclusion. We inherited them. We are like hermit crabs, wandering along the shoreline of history, finding the magnificent, abandoned shells of a far greater, more advanced civilization, and crawling inside to claim them as our own. We occupied these buildings, we repurposed them, the sprawling palatial estates of the Tartarian Empire, designed for a society of abundance, free energy, and profound architectural beauty, were seized by the architects of the New Reset. They didn't know how to build them, and they certainly didn't know how to operate the atmospheric technology embedded in their very walls. So they stripped them of their original purpose. They downgraded them. And what better way to hide the truth of these incredible palaces than to declare them off-limits? By turning the inherited palaces of a lost global civilization into horrific, insane asylums, the new controllers ensured that the public would stay away. The walls that were built to resonate with healing frequencies became prisons. We are living in the ruins of a stolen world, occupying buildings we could never hope to construct, and pretending we were the masters who laid the foundation. If this anomaly were isolated to the eastern seaboard of the United States, we might be able to dismiss it. We might force ourselves to believe that a few overzealous architects and a temporary surplus of cheap immigrant labor produced a localized architectural miracle. But history is never that neat. When you pull back the lens, when you look at the global timeline of the mid to late 19th century, a terrifying symmetry emerges. The pattern does not just continue, it envelops the entire world in a span of a few short decades. Let us cross the ocean. Pan your eyes across this archival photograph of the Airedale Mental Hospital, supposedly built in the 1860s in Ararat, a rural town in Victoria, Australia. Look at the staggering footprint of this complex. It is a city unto itself. We are looking at 63 individual buildings, boasting massive towers, perfectly arched arcades, and millions of precisely laid bricks. The history books tell us this was built shortly after the area was settled by prospectors during a gold rush. Think about the physical reality of that claim. We are looking at a localized population living largely in canvas tents and crude wooden shacks, connected by unpaved rutted dirt tracks that turn to impassable sludge in the rain. Yet, emerging from this primitive frontier, we are supposed to believe they sourced, transported, and assembled an architectural masterpiece that rivals the greatest palaces of Europe. Look at the shadows casting over the perfect, classical columns. Notice the intricate metalwork on the roof lines. Where were the industrial foundries in 1860s rural Australia to forge those massive iron gates? Where were the kilns capable of firing millions of perfectly uniform bricks in a matter of months? The official record waves these questions away, relying entirely on our modern complacency. But the pattern repeats. Let us shift our gaze back to Europe. Look at the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in London, featuring what was recorded as the longest single continuous corridor in Britain. Look at the Hospital Borda in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Look at the sprawling psychiatric fortresses in St. Petersburg, Russia. Examine the archival photographs of these structures side by side. Notice the haunting, undeniable similarities. We see the exact same Greco-Roman and Beaux-Arts motifs. We see the exact same staggering proportions. Windows 12 feet high, doors seemingly designed for giants, soaring vaulted ceilings, and complex labyrinthine subterranean tunnel networks. We see the exact same oxidation on the massive copper cupolas. How does the official narrative explain this global synchronicity? We are asked to believe that independent architects, separated by vast oceans, operating in completely different economic climates and cultural backgrounds, suddenly woke up in the 1850s and 1860s with the exact same obsession: to build colossal, mathematically perfect palaces for society's most destitute and mentally unwell citizens. We are asked to believe they did this without telephones, without the internet, without commercial flight, relying only on steamships that took months to cross the globe, carrying paper blueprints that somehow perfectly translated into identical stone monoliths on 4 different continents simultaneously. When you map the construction dates and the geographical spread of these massive institutions, the coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. If you are building a global franchise of modern corporate headquarters today, with all the advantages of digital communication, globalized supply chains, and mechanized transport, it still takes decades of intense, centralized logistical planning to achieve basic uniformity. Yet we are told that Victorian-era bureaucrats and local masons accidentally achieved absolute architectural perfection across the earth using horses, ropes, and handsaws. It defies every law of logistics. It contradicts mathematical probability. The architecture is not a coincidence. It is a footprint. It is the footprint of a unified, global civilization, the Tartarian Empire, that spanned from the steppes of Russia to the plains of America, down to the shores of South America and the valleys of Australia. They shared a single, highly advanced understanding of structural engineering, sacred geometry, and atmospheric energy harvesting. These buildings were not designed in the 1850s. They were inherited in the 1850s. Look closely at the foundation levels in these old photographs. Zoom in on the street level of the Airedale complex or the American Kirkbride structures. Do you see how the massive stone blocks meet the earth? In many of these global locations, the bottom floor is half buried. We are told these are basement windows designed to let in light. But look at the architecture logically. Nobody builds a majestic, arched 12-foot window only to bury the bottom 6 feet in the dirt. These buildings were subjected to a massive cataclysm, a global inundation of mud, or a deliberate terraforming event that buried the lower levels of the old world. The people of the 19th century did not dig the foundations. They dug the buildings out of the mud. Once you recognize this universal blueprint, the true horror of the historical timeline sets in. The new inheritors of the earth found themselves in possession of a global grid of energy centers, healing temples, and palatial estates. They could not replicate them. They could not explain them to the surviving, traumatized populations. So they initiated a global campaign of repurposing. They took the most magnificent structures of the old world and rebranded them as the darkest, most terrifying places in the new world. By turning these global energy centers into horrific asylums, they ensured that the average citizen would never try to enter. They wrapped the old world's beauty in a shroud of madness, disease, and fear. The pattern is too perfect, the timing too exact, and the logistical impossibility too glaring to be a coincidence. We are looking at a coordinated global occupation of a murdered civilization. If we inherited these magnificent structures, if the massive psychiatric fortresses of the 19th century were merely the repurposed palaces of a fallen Tartarian civilization, then where is the paperwork of the transition? This was the question that drove me back into the archives. I wasn't looking for a deliberate cover-up. I simply wanted to see the original architectural blueprints. I wanted to see the engineer's signature, the supply manifests, the ledgers detailing the purchase of millions of tons of limestone and copper. But what I found instead was a gaping, meticulously curated hole in the historical record. When you start digging for the primary source documents of these colossal buildings, you encounter a recurring, highly convenient tragedy: fire. The official narrative relies heavily on the sudden combustion of paper. We are told that the blueprints for some of the most complex structures on Earth were lost in a regional courthouse fire, or a mysterious blaze in a municipal archive. Consider the 1890 United States Census, a crucial document that would have recorded the massive demographic shifts and labor forces supposedly building these structures. It was almost entirely destroyed by a fire in the Commerce Department building in 1921. Look at the United States Patent Office fire of 1836, which erased thousands of records of early technology. How convenient that the exact decades we need to verify this massive global construction boom are the exact decades where our records repeatedly go up in smoke. It is a mathematical improbability that so many critical archives housing the logistical proof of the 19th century building boom simply burned by accident. But paper is easy to burn. Stone is much harder to erase. Look at the archival footage and modern photographs of the demolition of these grand asylums. Look at the destruction of the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, or the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. Why tear down a masterwork of hand-cut stone and copper that supposedly cost the state a fortune to build? The official narrative tells us it was due to asbestos, upkeep costs, or modernization. But watch the footage of the demolition crews. Notice how the wrecking balls bounce off the solid masonry. Notice how the excavators struggle to pull down the intricately vaulted arches. They had to fight tooth and nail to destroy these buildings. It was not a matter of public safety. It was an act of deliberate surgical erasure. They are wiping the physical evidence of the old world from the map. They are removing the towering spires and the mathematically perfect facades so that future generations will never walk past them and ask, how did men with horses build that? This pattern of physical erasure extends far beyond the walls of the asylums. If you want to understand how an entire civilization can be demolished in plain sight, look at the World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Look at the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, or the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. We are told that within a matter of months, local governments built sprawling, magnificent, fully electrified cities of classical architecture, featuring massive reflection pools, functioning canal systems, and towering domed palaces. And we are told they built all of this out of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp, because it was only meant to be temporary. Look at the high-resolution photographs of these fairs. Zoom in on the intricate statues, the sheer scale of the columns, the water features that perfectly mirror the architecture. Does that look like temporary plaster to you? Or does it look like the systematic, highly publicized demolition of the last remaining Tartarian cities, disguised as a public exhibition? They found these magnificent, empty cities. They wired them with primitive light bulbs, charged the public an admission fee to walk through the ruins of their own stolen inheritance, and then, as soon as the fairs ended, they burned them to the ground, or blew them up with dynamite. They called it clearing the fairgrounds. I call it the final phase of a global demolition project. When you take this evidence, the missing blueprints, the impossible construction timelines, the systemic destruction of the asylums, and the burning of the world's fairs, and you approach the historical societies, what happens? When you ask the curators of these architectural museums for the raw, logistical supply chain documents that prove men with hand tools built these monoliths, what do you get? You get a polite dismissal. You get circular logic. It is in the history books, therefore it happened. But the refusal to answer the basic logistical questions is absolute. The silence is deafening. There is no debate, because to debate the logistics is to admit that the official narrative is mathematically impossible. We must therefore consider a chilling hypothesis. What if the mid-19th century, roughly between 1850 and 1890, was not an era of unprecedented industrial progress, but a reset window, a highly coordinated, meticulously managed period of historical laundering? I cannot claim this with absolute certainty. The evidence is entirely circumstantial, pieced together from the shadows of what is missing. But if you view this era as a reset window, everything suddenly makes terrifying sense. The old world was buried in mud. Its technological marvels were stripped and replaced with centralized metered power grids that we had to pay for. Its grand palaces and energy centers were locked down and rebranded as insane asylums. And the surviving populations, the people who perhaps remembered the transition, who remembered the Tartarian heritage, who asked too many questions, were quietly rounded up, labeled as lunatics, and locked inside the very buildings their ancestors had constructed. The history was rewritten, the names were changed, the archives were burned, and the remaining physical evidence was systematically slated for demolition. The reset window closed, and the modern world, with its downgraded architecture and its fabricated history, was born. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like to live in the world before the reset. Close your eyes and envision a civilization that did not build for mere survival, but for absolute harmony with the natural laws of the universe. The palaces we now call asylums were not anomalies. They were the standard. Picture cities without the suffocating smog of the Industrial Revolution, without the endless, tangled webs of electrical wires blocking the sky. Instead, picture towering structures of flawless marble, intricate limestone, and red brick capped with magnificent copper domes that silently pulled limitless, clean energy directly from the atmospheric ether. This was a society of abundance. Water flowed freely through ornate, mathematically perfect fountains charged with frequencies designed to promote perfect health. The architecture itself was a form of medicine. The vast vaulted ceilings and perfectly proportioned corridors of these great buildings were constructed using the principles of sacred geometry and cymatics. They were acoustic healing centers designed to resonate with the natural frequencies of the human body, elevating the mind and spirit simply by walking through their massive wooden doors. Now imagine being one of the last people to remember that world. Imagine surviving the cataclysm, whether it was the global mud flood, the coordinated fires, or the sudden systemic erasure of your culture. You wake up in a downgraded reality. The free atmospheric energy is gone, replaced by meters, coal dust, and a centralized grid. The beautiful, sweeping avenues of your youth are suddenly filled with mud, horse-drawn carts, and a new, brutal system of commerce. And when you speak of the past, when you try to tell your children about the humming copper domes, the wireless transit, and the profound beauty that was violently stolen from them, you are labeled a lunatic. This is the true, unspeakable tragedy of the 19th century psychiatric boom. The new inheritors of the earth did not just steal the buildings, they weaponized them. They took the very acoustic temples built to heal the human mind and turned them into prisons for those who refused to forget. They placed the last witnesses of a utopian civilization inside the masterpieces their own people had built, locking them behind heavy iron gates and subjecting them to the dark, primitive medical practices of a downgraded age. Look around at the world we have been given in exchange for our stolen inheritance. Look at the modern architecture we are told represents the absolute pinnacle of human progress. We live and work in utilitarian boxes of poured concrete, cheap glass, and drywall. We spend our lives in perpetual debt, laboring endlessly to pay utility monopolies for energy that was once drawn freely from the sky. We are surrounded by a gray, brutalist degradation that slowly numbs the soul. The official narrative demands that we look at a modern strip mall or a concrete hospital and feel grateful for our advancement. They tell us that the people who built the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum or the massive Airedale complex were primitive, riding in wooden wagons and reading by candlelight, while we are the advanced ones. But the physical evidence betrays the lie. We are the downgraded society. We are the diminished survivors living in the ruins of a golden age, convinced by the architects of the narrative that our current state of endless toil and aesthetic poverty is a triumph. There is a profound, almost suffocating melancholy that settles into your bones when you truly understand what was taken from us. It is the feeling of being an orphan wandering the halls of a magnificent ancestral estate, only to be told by the hostile caretakers that you are merely a trespasser who must pay rent to exist there. We were robbed of our history, yes, but more importantly, we were robbed of our potential. The Tartarian civilization left behind a blueprint for a world without scarcity, a world where engineering and art were indistinguishable, and where the well-being of the human spirit was built into the very foundation of the cities. By silencing the last witnesses, by labeling them insane and burying them in unmarked graves behind the asylum walls, the controllers successfully severed our connection to that potential. They ensured that we would wake up every day believing that struggle, ugliness, and limitation are the natural order of the human condition. But the stone remains. The massive foundations, the inexplicably precise masonry, the soaring spires, they are still there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to wake up. When you drive past one of these monolithic structures, or look at the archival photographs of the ones they so desperately tore down, you can no longer see a mere hospital for the insane. You see a captured palace. You see the physical manifestation of a stolen timeline. The facade of the official narrative completely crumbles, and the sheer magnitude of the deception reveals itself. You see the absolute beauty of what we were, and the quiet tragedy of what we have become. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The illusion is forever broken. We are left to wander through the remnants of a world we do not fully understand, surrounded by architectural impossibilities that the official narrative desperately tries to ignore. The great psychiatric institutions of the 19th century stand as silent, imposing testaments to a transition of power that was anything but peaceful. They were not monuments to Victorian medical progress. They were the tragic holding pens for the last remnants of a civilization that had mastered the harmony of energy, sound, and stone. The people locked behind those massive iron doors were not insane. They were the unfortunate souls who remembered too much, who refused to accept the brutal downgrade of their reality, and who bore witness to the greatest architectural theft in human history. When you study the archival photographs of the magnificent domes and spires that were so hastily demolished, ask yourself why the official record demands such blind faith. Why do the logistics of their construction present a mathematical contradiction that no historian is willing to address? We are told to accept that horse-drawn wagons and hand chisels produced a global grid of acoustic healing palaces in a matter of months. only to be immediately filled with society's outcasts. But the stone does not lie. The mortar lines, the intricate copper finials, and the sheer, staggering scale of these buildings tell a story of inheritance, not construction. We are the inheritors of a stolen realm, living in the shadows of giants, forced to pay for energy that once flowed freely through the very walls we now use to lock away our forgotten history. If the history books are correct, then these massive buildings are merely the eccentric products of a bygone era. But if the physical logistics are true, if the material science and the global coordination problem prove that these structures could not have been built by the society credited with them, then what else has been hidden from us? Who were the architects of this great reset, and what did they truly erase when they burned the archives? The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.